a recorded webinar. So if you know somebody that would like to view this webinar later on, or maybe you know somebody, or you'd like to review all the other webinars that we've already done, they're all available at crestofbutemuseum.com. A big thank you to everybody for coming tonight for the fourth in our series, I believe. Yeah, fourth in our series celebrating National Preservation Month, where we discuss historic structure projects throughout Gunnison County. Thank you, Jody, David, and Dwayne for presenting today. I'm really looking forward to learning all kinds of new stuff myself. For everybody joining us this evening, please consider becoming a member of the museum. Just go to crestofbutemuseum.com in order to find out your member benefits and to sign up, or please consider making a donation to support programming like this. We're going to begin this evening with a short history of the city of Gunnison from Dwayne Vandenbush, and then Jody Reeser and David Primus from the Gunnison County Historic Preservation Commission will share all about the rehabilitation of the 8th Street School and the Gunnison Hardware Building, which is now the Center for the Arts. They will also be discussing the Gunnison Gas and Waterworks Building, which is a historic structure that was recently torn down. So we're going to get both sides of the coin. Things that went very well and went to the best, and then things that sometimes we run into issues and we can't save everything. At the end of today's presentation, we'll have 15 minutes at the end for questions. So if anybody in the audience has a question, please put it into the chat or put it into the Q&A. You can find all those down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There will also be a survey that pops up at the end of this. When you leave this webinar, there will be a survey. Please fill it out if you have not already. Basically the survey is to find out what you like, what you don't like, and what you would like to see more of or see less of. We want to hear back from our audience so that we provide programming that you guys like. Again, please consider becoming a member of the Crested Butte Museum. Thank you to everyone for joining us. And with that, I'd like to pass it off to Dwayne, who will start us out with a short history.
Thank you, Nell. Aside from prehistoric people who lived here 10 to 12,000 years ago on top of Signal Peak and on top of W Mountain and maybe in other areas, the first real inhabitants of the Gunnison country were the Ute Indians, who came into this region as early as 1600. And they lived in the Gunnison Valley. There were about 2,500 of them, and they lived in the Gunnison Valley in the summertime. And they got out of here in the winter and went to the Uncompahgre Valley. In 1868, they were moved down to the Los Pinos Indian Reservation, not very far from Cochetope Pass. And then 7 years later, as this area began to open with miners and ranchers coming in, they were moved out forever and moved over to Kelowna, 12 miles south of Montrose. And then in 1881, they were moved out of Colorado completely outside of the southern Utes around Ignacio and Toywalk and moved into the Uinta Mountains of Utah. The second group of people who came into the Gunnison country were Spanish explorers. And the original name of the Gunnison River was the Rio de la San Xavier. Now, the Spanish were in the Gunnison country for a variety of reasons. As early as the 1600s, they were looking for gold. They were also looking for a good route out to California and their mission stations out there. And they also wanted to convert the Native Americans. However, they were way too far away from their supply lines. The weather was too bad. They never found any gold. So the Spanish never had one permanent settlement in the Gunnison country. And then came the fur trappers, the mountain men, and the great era was 1807 to 1842. And a number of them came into the Gunnison country, including one Ezekiel Williams, who also trapped along the upper Arkansas River, not too far from Leadville. And in 1823, he talked about this area, and he said it wasn't very good because, and I'm quoting his exact words, the rivers was froze up too much of the year. So in other words, it was a very short season, even though there were a lot of streams. Following the mountain men came the explorers, and they were highlighted by one John Williams Gunnison of Goshen, New Hampshire, and West Point. Gunnison in 1853 was on a railroad survey to find a possible transcontinental railroad out to the West Coast. Came over Cochito Pass, and in September of 53 came right through where Gunnison is today and out towards the Black Canyon, eventually going out to where Montrose and Grand Junction would be. And in 1853, in October, in southwestern Utah, he was killed by Ute Indians. And this area was never really considered as a transcontinental railroad route because too much snow, too many ravines, too many canyons, so it really wasn't fit for that. In the early 1870s, the two fathers of the Gunnison country came in. Riding a horse in a blizzard on Christmas Day, 1872, was Alonzo Hartman. And Alonzo Hartman became the head of the Gunnison Cow Camp, which is located right where the Dos Rios golf course is today and about on the 13th green. And the word Dos Rios means meeting of two rivers, the Tamichi and the Gunnison. Hartman later on had a great ranch in the area. And the other guy who was a town father was Sylvester Richardson, who had come into this area with a geological expedition in 1873. When they went back in September, he stayed and he walked 500 miles. And he found the marble deposits, found coal deposits, but especially he loved the valleys with water. And the following year, he brought in 20 people in the Gunnison colony to establish a great farming mecca. Plenty of water, great possible land. So these are the first permanent settlements who came into the Gunnison country, May 1874, with Sylvester Richardson. 5 years later came one of the great silver rushes in the state of Colorado. And 25 to 40,000 people came to the Gunnison country by the year 1882. And the big towns that they filled up with 2,000 to 4,000 people included Tin Cup and Irwin and Gothic and White Pine and Pitkin. Crested Butte became known as the gateway of the Elk Mountains, the jumping off point to these great silver camps. Railroad town, supply town, smelter town. Gunnison was the hub of the wheel, and it really became the hub of the wheel when in 1881, the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad arrived in Gunnison, August 6, 1881. William Jackson Palmer Building, Denver, Colorado Springs, Pueblo, Canyon City, Poncha Springs, over Marshall Pass into Gunnison, and then he headed west trying to get out to the Pacific coast and ran a 28-mile branch up into Crested Butte. Trying to beat him in was John Evans and the great Denver South Park and Pacific. He left Denver and came in a year later. Turkey Creek Canyon, Kenosha Pass, South Park, Trout Creek Pass, Nathrop, through the Alpine Tunnel, down into Pitkin, Parlin, and arrived in Gunnison September of 82, 1 year too late. Four things led to Gunnison and the Gunnison country becoming a major Western Slope city and a major area. I always call them the 3 C's and the big T. One of the C's was cattle. And by 1910, there were 40,000 cows, 10,000 horses, 300 ranches in the Gunnison country, and we had the best bred cattle in the world. The other C was the college. Colorado State Normal School, a 2-year school, 1911. 1923, Western State College, today Western Colorado University, a great economic driver for the county. And the other C was coal. 9 great coal mines up at Crested Butte, 3 of them up Ohio Creek. Third biggest coal mine in Colorado was the big mine at Crested Butte, which lasted from 1894 to 1952. It was not uncommon to see 100 cars of bituminous coal being pulled through the East River Valley, headed for the CF&I steel mills in Pueblo. And then the big T was tourism. The Denver Rio Grande said on the side of their engine, "Scenic line of the West." Brought people in to see all that great scenery. Tremendous hunting, tremendous fishing, tremendous skiing. Today, the Blue Mesa Reservoir, 1.5 million people in every year. 400,000 skier days at Crested Butte, 200,000 people at the Black Canyon. We get about 2 million tourists a year in the Gunnison country. Today, Gunnison County is the 6th largest out of the 64 in the state, 3,300 square miles with 79% of the land federal. The Gunnison River is a major tributary of the Colorado, and it comes together at the appropriately named town of Grand Junction. The Gunnison and Colorado coming together. 25 years ago, Time magazine ranked counties in the United States by affluence or education. And Gunnison County was one of the top 20 affluent counties in the nation. With that, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce now Jody Reeser, Gunnison architect, who's going to talk about the 8th Street School and the Gunnison Art Center, and then historian David Primus, who's going to talk about the Gas and Waterworks. So Jody, you're on.
All right, thank you, Dwayne. So a little introduction. Good evening, my name is Jody Reeser. So I am a private practice architect based here in Gunnison. The other roles that I play, if anybody has questions I might be able to help, is that I am on the Gunnison County Historic Preservation Commission, and we are a certified local government, and so we have the ability to create landmark listings right here within our own county. I also sit on the Governor's Office's Colorado Historic Preservation Review Board, and that board reviews for state listings and then also for buildings in Colorado to go to the National Park Service for national listings. So if anyone has questions on that, either in this forum or by all means in my office, please give me a call. I'd love to help people out with that. I'm also fortunate enough to be a member of History Colorado's Archaeology and Historic Preservation Commission. And what that does is that reviews and approves the final grant recipients for the State Historic Fund. I know in previous lectures on this series, I've talked a little bit about the State Historic Fund, but because these two buildings that I'm talking about today are recipients of the State Historic Fund and how their preservation process came about is very much linked to that. I'll tell you a little bit more about it. So the granting body of the State Historic Fund, which is through History Colorado, is basically funded through the gambling profits of Black Hawk, Central City, and Cripple Creek. And that money is then for the support and guidance to nonprofits and government entities to help save local historic landmarks in our state. It's a very unique thing that Colorado has that most states don't have. So if anybody has questions on that, I'm more than happy to clarify anything that I possibly can as well. So Dave and I are going to talk about 3 buildings in the city of Gunnison that have very different preservation stories. So in contrast to a historic district like Crested Butte, or even a federal property like Justin Lawrence talked about, where there's sort of a uniform approach to how buildings get preserved or reviewed for preservation and rehabilitation projects. Gunnison, like most cities and towns, have a more varied approach to each landmark's preservation. All projects for historic preservation are throughout the U.S. are to be under the guidance of the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Preservation, and that sets our standards, so we all are sort of speaking the same language. However, different building owners, different funding sources, varying local jurisdictions, their views, attitudes towards preservation, as well as what codes might apply to those buildings can greatly affect the story of our historic resources. And these are 3 great examples of that. So I'll tell you about the 8th Street School Preservation and Rehabilitation Project, which is a great example of both very thoughtful, thorough process and a successful outcome. And the Gunnison Art Center, which is a bit more of an unconventional route to the preservation, but still a very successful outcome, as most people have driven by and see. It's a beautiful building. And then Dave will take a look at the Water and Gas Works building, which unfortunately has been lost. And I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. And let's see here. Slideshow. Come on now. Okay, this is a really great map. This is a great pictorial hand-drawn map from 1882. It's a really clear representation of the development pattern in Gunnison, and that very much relates to these buildings we're talking about. So a little bit back on what Dwayne was talking about, the original settlement. So when Sylvester Richardson came in, and he was working very hard, and Hartman also working very hard to sort of officially settle this town, there were several attempts that didn't really work out. And then finally, the group of founding fathers got really close, and then they basically got in an argument, and they split into two factions. And those two groups of men decided to plat two different towns. So there was a town of East Gunnison and a town of West Gunnison. And they actually were sort of competing developers on who was going to be the more dominant town. Obviously, over time, they then turned into one single town, and that was platted together. But you can really see in this particular map how that settlement was really separated and how it affected these buildings. So what you're seeing here is, so here's Boulevard Street right there. Here is Main Street right here. And Boulevard Street was a really important street. That's why it's a big, wide, park-like boulevard. That was sort of the heart. That's where the Levita was, Smith Opera House. That's where the heart of West Gunnison was. And it extended west towards the river. And then East Gunnison was along Main Street. And you can also see this is Tomichi, or what is now Highway 50, going through everything right there. The other things that were obviously very important were the railroad, which were part of this development that Dwayne also touched on. So this is the Denver Rio Grande that came in on Rio Grande Street today, and then goes north towards Crested Butte. And that railroad was very much allied with East Gunnison in its development, and you can see that here. Now the Denver, South Park, and Pacific was allied with West Gunnison, and they gave it resources and land to help develop it through town on their end. And you can see it coming in across San Juan, and then it turns and goes up alley, I believe near 11th Street, and up and over to Ohio Pass. So that really distinguishes these two areas. The red circles, Dave Primus went through this map in 2018 and did some really great research and identified which buildings were still standing as of 2018. And that's what the red circles are. The black squares are the three buildings that we're going to talk about. And so the other really important thing of the development is typical development and settlements started with tents and very temporary structures, moved on to log cabins. And then as you got sort of more established and more important, then you went to milled lumber buildings, and then the very prominent and sort of high stature buildings were going to be masonry buildings. And the three buildings that we're talking about today are all great examples of that. So over here, number 4, that's the 8th Street School. That's at 8th and Tomichi. Up here at the west end of Virginia, that is the Gas and Waterworks Building. And then over here, right at this main intersection, as many people know of Main and Tomichi, is the Gunnison Arts Center. What's now today is the Gunnison Arts Center. So that's kind of an overview. Then we'll jump into the 8th Street School. So of those founding fathers, that West faction group that started to develop West Gunnison was Sylvester Richardson, who we've heard of. Also a wealthy Civil War veteran named Captain Loudon Mullen, and St. Louis steel industry icon Ben W. Lewis, amongst a few others. Captain Mullen owned the majority of the land West Gunnison was built on and donated parcels for the advancement of the town, including where the 8th Street School was built. The county's first school board was formed in 1879, but without a dedicated schoolhouse. So prior to a schoolhouse, the school was conducted in various people's houses and within other commercial buildings, such as the back of the shoe store and also in the drugstore that Sylvester Richardson also owned. I don't know if he was Mr. Gunnison is what I've read in a few historic things. I think Dave said he hadn't heard that before, but he was sort of the man that was gung-ho to really make Gunnison work. And I think he had about as many hats and roles in the town as a person possibly could. So the school was actually built with private funds by these gentlemen, and then they officially donated it to the county as the first public school. The motivations being that a public school facility would encourage settling families to move to West Gunnison more vigorously than East Gunnison. So the competition was very real between these two towns. So sources do vary on the time of completion for the Little Brick Schoolhouse, but construction is cited as being between the late 1870s and 1881. Construction, especially for masonry building, didn't happen quite as fast as it does today. So it typically was a couple of years. I saw dates as back as 1877, which I think is a little early, but anyway, in that time period. Surviving to this day is a small wooden plaque above the main entry doors with the date of 1881. And you can see it here on this photo from 1964, and you can see it in 2010, and it's still there today. And that little sign saying 1881, we don't know if it's to signify the completion of the construction or the first opening student class that came into the school, or perhaps both, but it's been there as long as anybody knows, and it's a really great little sign. So the number of years the building was used as a school are also unknown. The Pine Street School opened in 1881, and construction soon was also beginning on two twin school buildings, one for East Gunnison and one for West Gunnison. So as Dwayne talked about, the population of this area was absolutely exploding, and it went from, the school district went from approximately 30 kids to, you know, talking hundreds of kids. So they were really scrambling to get this infrastructure going at this time. So by 1893, the little A Street School was actually sold by the school district to a private entity. And there was a 41-year gap in knowledge of what its use was. We do know that that owner also owned storage buildings and things connected to the railroad, to the Denver, South Park, and Pacific Railroad. So we don't know if he was using it in conjunction with that. It's very unknown. And then in 1934, it was sold, and it was turned into a residence. And it was used as a residence until 1963. The original woman that had it, that turned it into a residence, was only there for a short time. And in 1938, she sold it to the Farrens family. And they bought it for $1,000. And the family was actually, they were affected by the Great Depression, and they had to leave their ranch in Iowa, where the lake is now. And so they moved into town, and so the family managed to gather $1,000, and they bought this little building. And they had the building and lived in it until the 60s. And then at that time they left it and they boarded it up and abandoned it. A private school purchased the building in 2004, and they made the efforts to add it to the county's historic landmarks list. And then it was sold to the Gunnison Country Partners, which is now Gunnison Valley Mentors. And that was in 2010. And those folks, especially led by Executive Director Tina McGinnis, have really championed its rehabilitation and have cared for it ever since, and have done just an amazing job. They hired me as the architect in 2010, and they worked very hand in hand with the State Historic Fund. And the original grant was for a historic structure assessment, so that's where we began. And as typical is now with working with the State Historic Fund, and really is encouraged with any historic preservation building project, is to do a structure assessment. Really gathers the information of what the building is, what its state is, and sort of where you're beginning, what the history is, what's significant and what's important. And then you can take that information and combine that with what the goals are for how it wants to be rehabilitated, how it wants to be used and moved into the future, and you can create a planning document of that. And so that's what they did, and they did it in a really thoughtful and very thorough way. So these pictures of 2010, you can see it's in pretty rough shape. There's some broken stones there at the entry. The windows are all boarded up. A tree during a storm had fallen into the roof. And so what their goal is to have a space that is available for all of their youth activities, as well as being a community center. And that's exactly what it is today. So now we'll go into some of the rehabilitation, and I'll have to go through this pretty fast. It was a very extensive rehabilitation, pretty much top to bottom. So we have a lot of slides, so forgive me if I speak too fast, but I want to get through all of these because it's really fun to see all the things that we were able to work with on the building. So this is phase one. Phase one was the wall repair. So with a structural masonry wall, you really want to make sure that those are in good shape or your building is not likely to survive the future. This is 3 wise thick, so it's a very thick brick exterior wall. There were missing bricks, there were some damaged bricks, there was a fair amount of missing and damaged mortar joints, and there was some paint on it. And then also down at the bottom, it's on a stone foundation. And that stone foundation had similar problems, missing mortar, missing stones. You can see in this picture, there was some actual gaps. This is where the brick wall bears down on the stone. Obviously, that's not a good place to have big holes in the wall because that's your ultimate bearing connection. So we wanted to treat those first to make sure that we had the stability for the structure as a whole. There was a little wash porch that was put on during its residential use on the west side here. Not only was it in terrible shape, but it was actually contributing to some problems on that wall. So we were also removing that in this phase. And that process was done. We're actually really fortunate. We have a lot of great resources in Western Colorado for specific historic preservation craftspeople. We can always use more, but we have a very well-known company called Stonecraft out of Salida that does some really incredible regional, really all over the US, but mostly regional in the Rocky Mountains and in the Western US for historic stonemasonry. And he came up and worked on this project, and it was really great to watch their crew. So this was it at the end of phase one. And you can see the difference in the walls. They're obviously much more uniform. We don't have paint. We don't have a bunch of missing bricks. There was actually a big stress fracture that kind of came down here that wasn't, it wasn't so terrible that we had to take part of the wall or anything like that, but they repaired and stitched that together. There's some techniques that we can use with steel and things like that hidden within there to stitch those back together, so it has a long life ahead of it. One unique feature that I want to note in these pictures, because we'll get again at the end, is this little round circle right here. So as I said, Captain Mullen owned pretty much from Boulevard Street clear west to the river. This is in the lowland area close to the river, and in big flood years, this area would flood. This is an old school mitigation method for floods that could come up and damage buildings. So obviously, if we have a lot of water pressure coming against a building, especially a masonry building that doesn't have a lot of ability to move, it can really push it down and cause some trouble. So somebody put and this was probably the Ferrens family, they did a lot of work on this building. They put a culvert on each side. So literally and it still would function the same way today, so we kept it in. The river would literally run right through the bottom of the building, and that would allow it to pass through and not damage the building. And I have no doubt that that has happened more than one time with this building, and it continues to work. So we'll move on to phase two. Phase two, we talked about that storm damage on the roof. The roof structure was hand-built 2x trusses, which was really great because, again, part of that settlement development was milled lumber, and the craftsmanship and the skills to be able to work with that and create these structures. You can see in these pictures we had some damage. I believe that was probably from the impact of the tree. There was also, you can't see it quite as well, but there was some deflection. You know, obviously today we calculate snow loads and things of that nature. Back then it was more, it was a little bit more just common sense approach, if you will. And so what we did to fix it is not only do we stabilize what was there, but the key with any of these projects is even if it's there and it's a little bit broken, but if you can keep that historic fabric of the building intact, that really tells the story of the building in the future. So hopefully 100 years from now, if somebody has to come in and work on this building, what they'll be able to do is they'll be able to see these original trusses, and then we just set in new trusses to help take the new load and repair anything that wasn't working at the time, right in between, and we left all the original. Here's a great picture. You can see that structural wall comes all the way up to the top, those old trusses on each side, and then we just landed new ones right next to it. A local framing company was able to do that. We had local craftspeople. The general contractor for all phases of this project, it took about 5 years for all 3 phases of the project. Local Christopher Klein Construction was the contractor, and he worked with not only regional when we needed them for specialty work, but also a lot of local contractors, which really just worked out great. The roof sheathing was also, because the roofing itself was damaged and wasn't very well kept over the years. There was a lot of water damage and rot. So we weren't able to keep the old planking. It was mostly rotted and broken. So we did go ahead and put on new roof sheathing to really give it a lot of strength. And then, but the fascia and soffit actually were in pretty good shape. And there's actually a nice little decorative frieze trim at the top as well. So those were all taken off, taken back to the shop, rehabilitated, and then brought back and put back onto the building. And then there was one remaining chimney outside. So we brought the masons back and they repointed it and fixed the bricks. And so that is also there today. We also put in new utilities in late 1930s. I'm fortunate enough to speak with one of the children that grew up in this, one of the Farron's children. I think she's passed now, but at the time of this report, I was able to talk to her. And so she gave me some information on what she remembers her father doing. And they dug a well, and you can actually still see signs of that on the site, but they brought water into the house through a well. When there was city utilities available, they did tap into those, but they had been so abandoned for so long that those were no longer appropriate. So we brought in new utilities. This is when they were digging in the new sewer line. You can imagine it's a little precarious bringing holes in through the bottom of a big masonry wall. So that was kind of an exciting adventure, but everything worked out just fine. And so this was the end of phase 2. And you can see beautiful new roofing. This is asphalt roof, but we did use a kind that is acceptable replication of what would be basically a wood shake that would have been used back at that time. You can see how well the fascia and soffit came out and that frieze trim. And then the grading, there's a little sewer clean out. All the utilities were nicely tapped into and put in the crawl space. All right, and then this is the big phase of construction, phase 3. So phase was really putting the final touches and bringing this back up into being a really usable building. One of the most exciting days for me was when we took all the boards off of the old windows. I could see them from the inside, but you couldn't see them from the outside. So that was really exciting. The Farron's family, when they first abandoned the building, there was vandals that came and broke out a lot of these window panes. And that's why they were conscientious enough to go back and board up the windows and the doors to try and stop that. And it really did a good job. So most of the window structure itself was still in good shape. A lot of the panes of glass were still there also. Okay, the inside was in pretty rough shape. So you can see on the left, this is the old plaster and lath ceiling. It's all falling down. This is the old entry door. Again, the ceiling falling down. This is one of the old chimneys. This is actually parts of the old original door. However, Mr. Farron's had taken his chainsaw to it. So he wanted to make it more residential, and so he modified it to a degree that it no longer really works very well, but at the time it worked for them in a residential capacity. You can see the old wainscot here. That was still in some of the rooms. It's an old just wood beadboard with a nice chair rail on it, very nice detail. And then this is the little bathroom. They put in a bathroom, I forget what she told me, in the late 1930s, early 40s, I think they put in a bathroom, obviously modified through time. This is what it looked like in the by the time we got a hold of it. And then in this picture, you can see the interior rooms that were created. When this was a residence, luckily the main structure really remained unchanged. They didn't change the windows, they didn't change the overall door openings, things like that. But they did put these thin beadboard panels to create room. So they created a couple of bedrooms, a kitchen, a dining room, and a living room. And so those were all new. When it was a schoolhouse, it was just a big one-room schoolhouse. So this is when we were working on the floor. So you can see, I love this picture because you can also see the center stone wall. So whereas today we often use beams to shorten the span in the middle of a floor, back then they very commonly built another support foundation wall, which they did here. These are the old original log joists. The cut timber here, the wood 2x, those were from Mr. Ferrens. He put those in to support the floor because there were some sagging spots. I know he also used some railroad jacks and some other techniques, basically just to get it up to snuff. And then you can see in this picture, you can see some of the broken damage and things that have happened even since then. And then we're also bringing it up to current commercial code. So we needed to strengthen that even more. So we did a similar technique as we did at the roof, and we dropped in new support right next to these existing. So we didn't take out hardly anything. So these tell a story, the original log, and then also the 1940s wood tells its own story. So we left those in place and just added new supports in between. There was a decent amount of pine flooring that was left. And so that was removed and put in the shop and refurbished, and that came back in. We'll see it in a picture here towards the end. This is in process. You can see they're framing up where the bathroom is today, and what we did is we left as much of that lath as basically would hang on in the ceiling, and then added new nailer support so we could finish out the ceiling with new drywall. Added electricity. There was some old electric, old lights and such that was added at some point across the time, but we brought in more modern electricity, modern plumbing. And there had never been a typical heat system in this building. So it had always been just the wood stoves. And so we were bringing in heat also. And so we had to think about the thermal dynamics that created in these old buildings. And that's a really important thing to think about, is old buildings don't function like new builds. So when you add things like heat or humidity or things like that, you have to sort of treat them in different ways. So we added vapor barriers where it was appropriate. We added insulation where it was appropriate. This is during the drywall phase as we're moving right along there. The windows were taken out and they were taken down to a shop in Salida, and there's a craftsman there that had good experience with rehabilitating old windows. And so he had matching panes of glass and things like that. So he was able to fix those up like the original, bring them back up, put them back in, balance them, and they work today. So that was a really great feature. Anytime that we can repair an old wood window, not only is that appropriate per the Secretary of the Interior standards, but it's really fantastic. Modern windows, as great as they are at some things, they are made to be thrown out. So the best current window is still only probably a 20, 30 year lifespan, and then it's made to go in a dumpster. The old historic wood windows are really the only windows that are made to be repaired. So it's fantastic that we can still repair those. You can always add storm windows to help with insulating factors and things like that. But it was really fantastic to have all of these original old wood windows. And this is the finished product. So by all means, drive by and take a look. It's a beautiful building. The paint scheme was not only what we found underneath the layers on the windows, but the descendant of the Ferrens family that I spoke with, she also said that to her knowledge, what was passed down to her is that everything was originally white, so they repainted that. We put in a new entry, and then on the back we also put in an ADA ramp so that this would be more usable to more people. And then here's a picture of the inside. So this is all that old original pine floor, and then you can see we've got some, I think they used some fir or something, but anyway, just blended it. Again, sort of signifying the difference between the old and the new. You don't necessarily want to trick people in historic preservation. So when you do have to use new things, go ahead and let it say that it's new, but it's complementary. You can see the old wainscot that's around. We actually did create replica doors just to give that, it was such an important feature to how this building really looked and functioned that we had some of the old hardware actually. I think some of it we made matching, but there was some that was still there. And this is used today, like I said, Mentors uses it for their children's activities, and then they also rent it out as a community center building. So there's yoga classes in here. I think if you wanted to have a wedding reception or a potluck or something like that, it's available for that. You just have to go through Mentors to do that. So that was a really great project and obviously a fantastic outcome. And it was sort of in modern times our best case scenario on an approach to historic preservation of a building. Now I'm going to move on to the Gunnison Arts Center. And this one, like I said, it was a little bit more of an unconventional route, but still a very successful project, and it's also ongoing. So part of what we do is we have to not only figure out how to preserve and fix or modify appropriately, but we also have to make a plan for the future. Because even when you preserve a building, then you still have to continue maintaining it in the appropriate way. You don't want to go down a bad maintenance path and in 20 years from now, then all of a sudden, then you've damaged the building unknowingly. So a little bit about the Gunnison hardware store, which is, it's on the state level listing. And it was actually originally called the Meshling Building. And it was in 1880, a woman named Mary Meshling purchased the property at the prominent intersection of Main Street and Tamichi. She hired local master stonemason Frederick Zugelder and his company construct the stone building. And it also added a very distinct decorative wood cornice, which is one of the most distinct wood cornice features and building features of any of our buildings in Gunnison, and it survived beautifully. It was completed in 1882, and Ms. Meshling leased the main level to the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad for use as its freight offices. And then the upper level was operated as a hotel. 6 years later, in 1888, Ms. Meshling sold the building, and it became the Gunnison Hardware Company building. The majority of this building's existence, it was a hardware store. This was, I don't know an exact date, but I imagine this was back in around that time. There's a fuzzy little date down there, but you can't really make it out. But obviously there's no pavement, there's no cars, anything like that. And this was right as its early days as Gunnison Hardware. This picture, I believe per the cars down here, somebody estimated for me that it was probably around the 1930s. Different owner, went through several owners, but it was still a hardware building. And you can see some modifications. Luckily, the storefronts are still pretty much the same, but they added an awning and some signs. And then in the 1940s, the hardware store did install, and I'll show you a picture after this one in just a second, but they did install a new window and door on the north wall. So right over here, you can see this is all a big blank stone wall. Somebody at some point, one of the hardware store owners actually cut a hole in that. And so that was a notable modification. Various awnings and signs came and went. The large rooftop chimney stacks were removed. You see those up there, obviously an old school heating system. So those were removed sometime during its life as a hardware store, but the fundamental features of the structure remain largely unchanged. The Klinker family owned the first sporting goods store in Mount Crested Butte, and they were the ones that bought it in the 70s. And they purchased it to expand their sporting goods empire down to the south end of the valley. And they installed this very large wood awning. This was definitely the most notable change of the exterior throughout this building's life. They also added some wood shutters. You can kind of see them here. And it really changed it. So they operated it as a sporting goods store, and then that closed, and they leased it out to a restaurant. And then they took their own hand at doing a restaurant and a dance hall. And I understand there was a fair amount of damage to the interior floor because of all of the dancing, and I'm sure spilled booze and all the things that come from a bar and a dance hall. So in 1989, a new nonprofit group named the Gunnison Council of the Arts worked with the bank, because it had fallen into bank receivership, worked with the bank to enter into a lease with purchase auction on the property in 1989. By the time the group was able to purchase the building in 1992, the State Historic Fund had been created. It was only 2 years old, so this was just great timing as this was sort of starting to be a resource for old buildings in the state of Colorado. The the Arts Council at that time applied for grants for their grant program, and they were approved, and they got 2 different grants. It was, in 1993 is when they put it on the state landmark list, and then they applied for those grants. The process back then from the State Historic Fund, and really from a lot of historic preservation, was a little bit less defined than what it was today. So what they did is they didn't do a historic structure assessment, because those weren't necessarily standard practice, and neither were they required as they are today in most cases for State Historic Fund monies. So they did sort of a grassroots effort on rehabilitating this building, and they used a lot of old pictures. These are some newspaper articles, and it's just, some of the pictures that you can see. So again, here's the original Denver and Rio Grande Railway Express sign on the side of the north side of the building. This is some hardware store. This is Clink's, the dance hall. This, you can see, this is the north side. So this is a huge window in the front, and then this big, basically, storefront that they opened up on that north side. And then this is that big awning. So with those first grant monies, what they did, have pictures of that work. That was well before my time of practicing as an architect and being here in Gunnison and working on these buildings. But you can actually see here, and again, early techniques, they were doing the best they can, and this has been improved over time. But this is the infill of that old window that was there. This is it today. It's actually much more uniform. They've done even more work. But they also fixed some of the repointing of the mortar joints, some of the stone. I spoke to one of the contractors that was, I believe, helped on the project back in the 90s. And somebody said that they had found a picture at some point that had these little teepees, basically. I haven't found a historic picture of those, but they're an interesting feature that are here now. I don't believe they were original, but somebody found a picture and did, like I said, they did the very best they can, and I think they did a fantastic job. They also fixed up the storefront. One thing they did do is they did replace a lot of the windows. I'm not sure exactly what condition those original wood windows were in, but now the arch top of the windows is actually faux. It's no longer the curved glass. So there were some things that have been lost over time, but again, the building's still standing and it's beautiful. So the Gunnison Council for the Arts hired me then in an effort to make a future plan. They hired me in 2016 and got another grant from the State Historic Fund to do a historic structure assessment at this time. So what that did, again, is it gathered the information and we evaluated the building sort of top to bottom. And it not only is it at a point that it needs some maintenance work, so we helped create five-phase plan for that on how they can approach that. But throughout time, the best way for a historic building to remain in use is for it to be modified to some degree so it still works for modern times. And they were finding some things that needed to be modified, so they're working on those now. Let's see, I can show you a couple interior pictures. So some of the things they did, I'll just recap a little bit. Obviously, the big wood awnings and shutters they took offside. They infilled the north wall. They did some repointing in that 1990s grant round. They replaced most of the windows, but I think all of the exterior doors and hardware, I believe, maybe not all the hardware, is original. So those they were able to rehabilitate and keep. The exterior sidewalk, they did some sort of curbing here this also has a stone foundation and actually a big stone basement that's very cool, very fun to go down into. So there was basically some buttressing that was done to that. And then, like I said, some new doors and windows and the repainting and details on that unique wood storefront. The ceilings, these are the original beadboard ceilings that were there, but unfortunately they came in and they put, appropriate at the time, as they thought was the best solution, a texture spray that it may have had asbestos in it. I would guess it probably does, so it helped with some of the fire features, fire mitigation. And then it's got a very piecemeal mechanical system. So what the folks are working with the State Historic Fund now, they put a new roof on. They're doing some maintenance to that wood on the storefront to make sure that gets to live on in time. And then they also, the old, like I said, the old wood floor, it is mostly underneath this this new laminate floor made to look wood that is placed over it. So part of the historic structure assessment is we really talked about possibilities of taking that out and restoring the old wood floor and how you can do that best. So that is the end of my part. They're two a little bit different approaches, but fantastic projects that we got to see saved in Gunnison, and obviously very important buildings to the town and the development of the town. So now I'm going to hand it over to Dave, and he's going to talk about the Gas and Waterworks Building.
Thanks, Jody. Now I'm a little concerned about time. My presentation will take about 6 or 7 minutes. Shall I go ahead with that?
Yes, please do. I think we can spare it. Yeah.
All right.
Sorry, Dave, I had a lot to talk about.
That's right. All right, can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Gunnison Gas and Waterworks Building in Gunnison, which, as Jody mentioned, was lost in 2017, unfortunately, but it's a pretty neat building, and it kind of became special to me being on the Historic Preservation Commission and taking a little effort to try to preserve this in some way. This building was built in 1882 to produce gas and water for the booming city at the time, and did that for quite a number of years. And then for probably the majority of its life in the 1900s, it was used as part of the city shop facilities. Just a second. All right. And this is located at 7th Street and Virginia, which is at the extreme west end of Gunnison. And as I said, that whole block now is the city shop. And this is a Sanborn insurance map kind of detailing the building. And this is probably the best picture we have of the building. As you can see, the building's on the left with the large smokestack. The superintendent's residence is on the right. And I kind of like this building. Number one, you can see what a beautiful stone building it was. It was probably built by the same stonemasons, the Zugelders, as the Art Center, built about the same time, and used the same stone from the same quarry. I also like this photo because it's obviously a depiction of the local fire department displaying their capabilities at the time. And you can see the horse-drawn hose carriers there and shooting their streams way up in the air. This building was primarily built, to pump water through the town, but also to produce gas and pump that through the town. And you might wonder why gas and not electricity, and that's because at the time electricity was really in its infancy, and if you wanted to light your streets, which Gunnison did, gas was the way to do it. And of course, there was no natural gas piped into the valley at the time, so you had to make it yourself. And it's interesting to me how they did this. They did this by converting coal to gas, and they did that by putting coal in big ovens in an oxygen-poor environment, heating it up with other coal, and that produced a mixture of hydrogen, methane, and carbon monoxide, kind of a toxic thing. And then if you burned that, it smelled terrible, like rotten eggs. And in addition, it produced sulfuric acid vapor, which obviously is not what you want drifting down onto your town building. So the last step is they had a lot of purification process where they pressurized the gas using water pressure, and then they bubbled that pressurized gas through water first, and then later through milk of lime, which is a mixture of lime and water, and that produced the gas that they pumped through town. It's interesting to me that this thing cost $200,000 to build in 1882, and today that would be, in today's dollars, $4 million. It was a big plant. They sized it to produce gas for 30,000 users. And as Dwayne said, in the early 1880s, everybody thought this town was going to go crazy. So that's what they did. It was also completely private. It was not tax-based at all. And it was financed by a St. Louis investor named R.B. Lewis, who continued to run the plant for many years. This is a little bit later photo, very similar to the one we just looked at, but you can see it's in the Gunnison News Champion in 1905. Interestingly enough, it was built in 1882 to produce gas, but by 1893, 11 years later, it had been converted to produce electricity, and all the lamps were changed to electricity. So as you can see in 1905, it is now called the Gunnison Light and Water Plant, no longer the gas plant. It was still owned by R.B. Lewis, and this little article was about Gunnison contemplating buying the plant and municipalizing production of utilities, which they did sometime shortly after that. This is another picture we have. Very few pictures of this exist that I'm aware of the delivery of oil to the building in 1940. And if you look right above the N, you can see an awning that's over the door, and then you can see the window to the right, so keep that in mind. And then this is a photo I took right before demolition, and you can see that same doorway with the green lamp over the top of it and the window to the right. This is the south wall of the building, the best preserved piece of the building. And I love this picture because it has, the ornate rock work in the window lintels and the window sills, very similar to the Art Center. The Historic Preservation Commission worked with the city to try to save this building. And we met with the city council. We explained its historical significance. We explored grants from the State Historical Fund. The fund came up, the people from the fund came up to look at it and help evaluate it. But the upshot is the building had been modified so many times in the past, almost 140 years, that only the south wall, the wall you're looking at there, remained of the original footprint. The rest of it had been expanded out. As you can see, there's an expansion off to the east there on the right of this picture. It was also not in a public accessible place. It was in the city shop area, and ultimately the city just needed the space to build a modern building to store and repair their garbage trucks. So we lost the building, and it's too bad. But a couple of good things that came out of this, and that is that I believe this raised the public awareness of historic structures in the city and their significance. Gunnison City doesn't have a lot of significant buildings left. And also the city agreed to carefully dismantle this wall and mark all the stones, and they saved all the stones from the building for some sort of future use. What that is, we don't know. A couple of things that have been mentioned is potentially reconstructing this wall, maybe at the Pioneer Museum, just to show what the building looked like, or possibly reusing the stones and the lintels and the sills and so forth in some sort of new building in downtown Gunnison with a, a interpretation sign in front of it. So that's kind of a quick overview of the loss of the Gunnison Gas and Waterworks. Thanks.
All right. Well, right off the bat, we've got a question for you. But before folks start to wander away, just a reminder to please consider becoming a member of the Crested Butte Museum at crestedbuttemuseum.com, or consider making a donation to support programming like this. This is being recorded, and the speaker series installments before this have also been recorded and are available at crestedbuttemuseum.com, and this one will be as well. So to kick it off, Mike Burns asks, I grew up in a house on the corner of Pine and Denver. The address is 623. The house is located on the west side of Pine and just south of Denver. The house would have faced east, and it was built in 1884. Can you tell me, is it on the map in that location?
I can't tell you without looking at that map right now, but if he would like to send me his email address, I'll email the map to him and he can look for himself. And
Great.
I'll put my email in the chat.
Okay, thank you. All right, Mike, so information is coming your way. Next, we've got from Chris Ray, how many ghosts were displaced during these renovation projects?
I can speak to that a little bit. Not that I encountered any, but there's some really great sort of local lore about the upper level of the Arts Center building. So it was officially what we could find that it was functioning as a hotel. However, there was also speculation that it was used as a rooming house, particularly women of early days. They needed sort of safe places to live. It's not like women just went out and bought or rent houses on their own. So a lot of them would have boarding houses, and that was supposedly part of what that was used for. And then the really fun part of the lore is that South Main Street was the red light district of Gunnison. And so there's also rumors that it wasn't a brothel. And so within all of that, and I think more heavily handed into the old maids of the boarding house and or the brothel, there are rumors that the upper level of the Art Center is haunted, and that they're still there, according to Carly, who is the executive director over there and who has her office up there, that there's been some strange things and strange noises. So I think they're pretty adaptable to rehabilitation projects. So I think they just kind of do their thing.
All right. My own question is, when you enter into these historic buildings and you start to rehabilitate them and you get into the walls, you start to find really interesting stuff. Were there any surprises that you weren't expecting to come out of those rehabs?
With any, whether it's a modern renovation project or an old rehabilitation project, on a sort of technical side, there's always things that we discover, like, oh, how are we going to treat this joint? So there was some of that up in the roof. There was part of the old chimney that was up there. So we were very careful about, okay, we don't have maybe the resources to recreate this chimney, but we want to make sure that it's very delicately cared for and kept in the shape that it is. So it's still in the attic up there. There were some old newspaper clippings that were found. That's probably the most common that's found in pretty much all of these. Not necessarily during a rehabilitation process, but during my structural assessment down in the basement underneath the Art Center, which the folks of the Art Center call it the dungeon, and they think it's just this terrible thing. The building nerd in me just absolutely loved it. It's just a beautiful space down there. You can see the old stone walls. You can see the old rough cut timbers, but you can also see the original floor planking. And the original floor planking, any little thing like that in these old buildings tells its own story. And often in those days, those items were branded. And if they came in from on railroad, which a lot of these pieces were, especially for a building right near the railroad. Obviously, Miss Meshling developed it. I don't know if she was in an agreement with Denver and Rio Grande when she was constructing it, or if that came later. I have no idea of knowing. But anyway, the flooring came from a really interesting company back in Pennsylvania. And so going down that route, I was able to research just that company, and you're able to find these fun stories within the overall story of the building. And there's a really great, old pine forest and old, original building company of the time in Pennsylvania that had this beautiful story. And those were all shipped to Gunnison. And you can still see the brand on the wood in the crawl space basement looking up into the floor. So all sorts of fun things you find.
Wow, very cool. Shelly Popke asks, is there evidence of tunnels between the buildings?
I'll take that one, and Jody, you can add if you have any evidence, but there's always been rumors of tunnels in Gunnison. Probably the most significant one was between the La Vida Hotel, which is a very fancy hotel on South Boulevard, and the Edgerton House, which is across Boulevard from it, where there were rumored to be prostitutes there, and the well-to-do men didn't want to be seen walking across the street to the house of prostitution. Also along New York, which was the primary, one of the primary streets. Boulevard was a primary street in West Gunnison, and New York was a primary street in West Gunnison, and that was definitely the red light district, and lots of saloons and fun happened there. There's also supposed to be tunnels there, and just a few months ago, a friend of mine said he was living in a house along New York when he was in college 20 or 30 years ago, and he actually went into a tunnel underneath New York Street. That's the first time I've ever heard a firsthand thing. And then finally, there's supposed to be a tunnel underneath Tomichi that goes to the art center from what's now Tomichi Cycles. But I don't know if that's true or not.
I can speak a little bit. I didn't find any tunnels in there, but there is a large portion of the east foundation wall down in the basement that is basically just concrete, which obviously didn't exist in 1880. So we know that was infilled. Those were often used for coal chutes and things of that nature. It's big enough to drive a car through. So I don't know. I mean, it's a very large swath of the wall. Is it possible? Yes, it's possible. I've heard different stories of those tunnels as well. When I was I've worked up at the history department at Western, and I was taking a class through basically a preliminary on how to do an evaluation of an old building. And one of the students in the class says he lived in a house on New York Street that is basically very close to where the La Vida was. And he himself had gone down into the basement with the mechanical guy and saw the tunnel connection down in that house. And that house is obviously still standing. That was only a few years ago. And then I can attest, not necessarily in Gunnison, but I have been in the tunnels in Denver, and they were same thing. So from the Brown Palace to Union Station, all over that area, there's tunnels all over in Denver. So they are a very real part of Colorado's history. They're now mostly, the reason I've been in them is I was early in my career working for a firm in Denver, and they're often mechanical spaces now. So we were going down to look at some of the mechanical on a big renovation between the Brown Palace and the hotel across the street. And the old whorehouse, basically, that's also adjacent to those, is the tunnels connecting all three of those buildings, and I got to walk through those. So they do exist in Colorado.
Cool. Arlene Bernholtz asks, what year was the 8th Street School completed, and how long did it take to complete from start to finish?
So that I touched on a little bit. It's sort of a mystery. So there is some research that I found that said it was started as early as 1877. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me, just knowing that the founding fathers didn't they were still really disorganized and having a hard time getting a cohesive plating plan for the town until really 1979 is when it started to come together. So for them to have had that much planning in place and that much security of developing, and West Gunnison, East Gunnison, that conflict didn't happen until 1879. So I can't imagine that they would have started the school building that early, but maybe there was some sort of basic planning from Loudon Mullen on, you know, in the future, this portion of my plan will go, or of my land maybe could be used for this, who knows. But the little sign that sits above the door very distinctly says 1881. You know, it could have been the year it first started classes, or it could have also been the first year that it was actually finished construction and was a usable building. You know, like the Gunnison Arts Center took 2 years to build that building. I would say it would take at least 2 years, given it was with private funding, and it was probably likely done with local labor. Maybe, you know, it's a little different process than today, whereas we did have the Zugelder brothers back then. That was a pretty well-defined company that came in and created buildings. A lot of it was, you know, just craftspeople that put together and tackled the building and stuff. So it was a little less formal process, and it often took a little bit longer.
I can make a quick comment on that, that there's really no way it was built in 1877, because the big rush to the Gunnison country didn't come until 79. And, you know, in the research I've done, I think the building was done in 1880 and completed in 81. Because the big group of people really didn't come in till 1880. So there had been no
totally
need for a big school, you know, that early, and certainly not 1877.
I agree. I think that's a little early.
Interesting. Mike Burns, he adds a note. It's not really a question, but adds to the history. He says the first ski shop in Crested View was owned by Dave and Renee Gorsuch. Clinker bought the business from Dave. So a little extra history. Thanks, Mike.
Great, thank you.
All right. Well, a huge thank you to all of our panelists again. Thank you, David. Thank you, Dwayne. Thank you, Jody, for joining us this evening. That was absolutely fascinating. And thank you guys for doing such great work. Thank you to the Gunnison Historic Preservation Commission for preserving these buildings and keeping an eye out and preserving this history overall. And to everybody who attended this webinar, please be sure to register for next week's webinar, the last one in the series, which is all about my personal favorite building, which is the museum building. I'm biased that way. Go to crestview.museum.com to sign up. Oh, it looks like we've got one last Q&A. Oh, Barbara Mason says thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our attendees. And everybody have a great night. Bye.
Thank you, Nell.
Thank you, Nell.